Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's 6:30, so we'll begin in a timely way. I'm Ed Byrne, the principal here at King's, for those of you who don't know me, and I might say it's great to see so many people from outside King's attending this event. This, of course, is the opening event of this year's Arts and Humanities Festival, which has become an incredibly important part of our annual academic calendar here at King's. I'd like to congratulate Professor Max Saunders and his team for putting such a wonderful festival together this year. Now, this year the festival's theme, as you would have seen, is World Service. This is not only a response to the opening of our great new space across the road, Bush House, former home of the BBC World Service, but also a reflection of King's role as a leading university in its service to society. We've developed collegiately, consulting almost 800 staff and students, a new vision for King's that many of you will have seen called Vision 2029. And perhaps the standout line is our determination to continue to be a leading university in service to society, to make the world a better place by engaging broadly with the communities around us. And this festival, the Arts and Humanities Festival, is a prime example of that type of engagement. I have to mention the BBC World Service, however, because as a young teenager, my family migrated to Australia. And I was kept in touch with the world for several years on a little transistor radio, listening to the cricket and the like. So I have deep affection for the BBC World Service, and I remember intimately those words from Bush House, London. King's is at the forefront of groundbreaking research in many disciplines, and the arts and humanities play a vital role in asking questions about how we engage with and how we understand our world. This is particularly important at times of uncertainty, indeed even at times what appears to be chaos in our politics today. This year's festival will try to answer some of the really central questions, with dynamic events addressing things such as Brexit, the refugee crisis, shifting borders, the role of the media, the role of universities, and just to round it out a little, the importance of creativity, something perhaps slightly more positive at the end. We'll be asking how and why recent global events have happened and what may happen next. The festival runs for 2 weeks across our Strand campus, including the Bush House extension, and there's something for everyone, whether you're a poetry fan, like me, into music, theatre, art, or you just want to learn something new or hear an interesting dialogue about a central question of the age. So do have a look at the festival brochure and go onto our website and book to attend some of the very interesting events. I'm absolutely delighted that we're opening the festival with an event that celebrates one of our major research projects, the Georgian Papers Project. This is a collaborative and interdisciplinary project that we're working on with our American partners at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture at William and Mary University in Virginia, and closer to home, the Royal Collection Trust. I've had the privilege to be exposed to this project a little, meeting some wonderful American colleagues who have a passionate interest in some of the major events in George III's reign. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, the Sons of Cincinnati, some amazing US organizations who've been helping with this project. I also had the immense privilege of meeting Her Majesty the Queen and being introduced to her at Windsor when the project was officially launched by Her Majesty in recent times, and I see some others in the room who enjoyed that memorable occasion also. The core aim of the project is to make all the papers in the Royal Archives, and these are the personal papers of the monarch, handwritten papers in the monarch's handwriting, and of course written by colonial governors and major military officials back to the monarch of the day, relating to the monarchs of the whole Georgian period between George I and William IV, the Sailor King, including our founder, George IV. This whole mass of hundreds of thousands of individual documents will be available online to scholars around the world by the end of 2020. It's an innovative project. It draws on our outstanding expertise, not only in history, but also the digital humanities. And of course, very exciting, our own scholars are working very actively on this immensely rich material at the moment. We've concentrated, I think, in the main on the American years, at least as far as foreign policy goes, but I hope, as somebody who's spent much of my life in Australia, we're going to hear a little more about Captain Cook, Joseph Banks, the Royal Society next door, the Southern Oceans aspect of George III's interest. And of course, in George IV's time, not only was this wonderful university founded, and he played a major role in that, but so much in the way of the type of thinking that established the British psyche for the rest of the century was being developed. This evening, we're going to have a virtual tour of the Georgian world, as our panel of experts show us some of the maps from George III's great collection and explain their significance in broadening horizons during the age of the Enlightenment. So please join us after the talk for wine and canapes upstairs in chapters. And it's now my great honour to pass over to Professor Max Saunders, the director of this year's Arts and Humanities Festival. Max.
Thank you very much, Principal, for launching the 2017 World Service Festival. I want to add my very warm welcome to you all this evening to the festival, to Kings if you're from beyond Kings. And just to add a few remarks, because we don't have a closing event for the festival, I'd like to thank some people at the start, particularly colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities who've really met the challenge of our World Service theme with such energy and imagination, coming up with what promises to be a really thought-provoking series of events over the next 2 weeks, one which I think really shows the faculty's research in its best light. I also want to thank the Arts and Humanities Research Institute team, Laura Douglas, the manager, Vicky, Angelina, and Madeline, and their helpers, or the student ambassadors who've been so sort of wonderful at making sure everyone gets to the right places for events in previous festivals, and I'm sure we'll do the same again today. They worked very hard all through the year developing the programme, and I think have done an amazing job again this year. And so, without more ado, let me introduce the chair of this evening's event, who is Professor Arthur Burns, who's the academic director of the Georgian Papers programme at King's College London. And I just wanted to say that I too am very pleased that we have an opening event on this project, which is definitely one of the jewels in the crown, if in a more literal sense than that's usually true. So, Arthur Burns.
Thank you very much, Max. We're going to have a surfeit of Maxes tonight, so we have 2 more on the bill. Just to say a very brief word of welcome from the Georgian Papers programme, which, as the Principal said, as every March, is a major collaboration for us with outstanding scholars across the Atlantic, but also with our colleagues in the Royal Archives as archivists work together with scholars to explore these papers at the same time. So trying to find new ways of delving into an archive in which an awful lot of it just simply is not yet known. And we've talked mainly so far, I think, in public about the George III papers, but in about a month's time, the second tranche of our papers will go live, and those include papers from George I and George II, as well as George III. So we'll begin to see the richness extending chronologically, as well as in terms of the range of subject matter. Another Watch This Space announcement in the next few weeks will be launching an initiative called the King's Friends, which will be a chance to join us virtually across the world as a follower of the project, who will get advance notice of what's going to be released, may have opportunities to integrate it into their own research or find opportunities to work with us in organising events around the globe. And we hope that will help build a virtual community of people properly engaged with this archive, so we make mutual discoveries going forward. And it's an exciting prospect for us, which we're all looking forward to. So watch our website, the Georgian Papers website, where that is all visible. And of course, if you've been inspired by tonight's talk to go and delve in the papers themselves, visit the Royal Collection Trust website, where you can actually get to grips with the manuscript material there as well. So tonight's event is going to take the form of two presentations about the maps, which so closely sit alongside the Georgian papers, in which there's an awful lot of material within that refers to those maps and helps us understand what they are. One of which is going to be by Peter Barber, the former director of the map collection at the British Library, and he will be talking about George III and his map collection. Then our second talk and our first Max will be Max Edelson, who's from the University of Virginia, and will be talking about the use of maps and how they fit into governance in North America, using his own digital platform, Mapscot, which you'll be seeing, and I've already seen this and it's fantastic, examples of how it works tonight. And those resources are going to be able, you can access them on the web. Afterwards, we will film tonight, we'll put that up on our Georgian Papers website at some point as well. So hopefully, if this is something that you begin to have an interest in, you'll be able to follow the map theme, which there'll be an awful lot more coming out about in the programme as we go forward. When we've had the talks, we'll pause briefly for a comment from our commentator, Max Edelson, the American historian who's based here at King's, and then we'll have a round-table discussion before going up to the drinks and canapés that we mentioned before. So without further ado, can I introduce Peter Barber to give us his talk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. George III viewed the world through the prism of maps. Now, in that respect, he was little different from many of his educated contemporaries, but the extent to which he viewed the world through maps was quite exceptional. He had a passion for maps that began almost before he was born. If he'd visited his grandfather in St. James's Palace, he would have seen this enormous atlas, the largest in the world, that had been presented to Charles II in 1660. This, by the way, is my Alfred Hitchcock moment. His father, as you can see here, was a very sophisticated gentleman. It's not, though, commonly known that he took a lively interest in maps. This is a map of Barcelona, which seems topical, that was presented to him. And he handed responsibility for acquiring the maps that he wanted to his chaplain and librarian, a Basel man called Caspar Wettstein. This is the bottom of the letter that he wrote. The British Library has his archive. Now, Wettstein was no mere chaplain and librarian. He was an intellectual, and he was in active correspondence with people like Leonhard Euler, the famous mathematician. Both men shared a great interest in maps. Euler edited one of the earliest atlases for children, but there's a case for saying that Caspar Wettstein invented the jigsaw puzzle. And the jigsaw puzzle took the form of this sort of dissected map, which was used to teach children not only geography but also history. And there are good reasons for believing, though I can't go into it here, that this is the very map that was used to teach George in 1744. And so impressed by George, so impressed with it was George, that he also had dissected maps to teach his children. Now, right from the start, George was associated with maps, and you might argue that this depiction of him with a globe was no more than what you would expect of an up-and-coming prince. This detail of another painting, though, of a larger painting, would argue the contrary, because you can see George with his brother pointing at a map of the defences of Portsmouth in 1751. The map still survives. It's by a guy called Desmarais in his collection. And when this painting was done, George was actually being taught the art of planning, of making plans of fortresses. And he was being taught it by Joshua Kirby. Now, Joshua Kirby is better known, perhaps, as a friend of Gainsborough and as the man who taught George perspective drawing, but he also taught George map making. And not surprisingly, a few years after George's accession, Joshua Kirby himself produced this revised map of Suffolk based on work done by his father. So there's no question that the young George talked maps with Kirby. But perhaps, as in so many other fields, the most important person was George's tutor and groom of the stool, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute. Here he is in a portrait by Alan Ramsay, looking very suave and very dashing, as indeed he was. And this is a portrait by the same artist, done in 1757, a year after Bute took over, showing the young George III. And I think the portrait expresses the uncertainty and insecurity that is also expressed in his correspondence. This is a man who was looking for a hero, particularly after the death of his father, and he found it in Bute. And from a cartographic standpoint, there could be no better guide. Bute was deeply into maps. This is a letter from Mary Ann Roke, the widow of one of the leading map makers of the time, and herself a map maker of considerable repute. And this is a sheet from an atlas that Bute commissioned from Roke a few years later. But Bute is not simply in touch with Roke and with Jeffries and with the leading map makers. He is an expert on maps in themselves. And in his correspondence, we have mentions of him asking for this very map to be purchased for the young George. And why? Because if you look at the map, a detail of the map, you can see that through this map, George would be able to undertake a grand tour without actually going to Italy. You can see the Hadrian's Villa, the remains of an aqueduct, everything that a tourist would want. And this is an early example of George using a map as a prism, as a substitute, if you like, for reality. So great was Bute's hold over George that he was given a separate account with Coutts Bank, which then as now is the Royal Bank. And in 1762, Bute used the money in his separate account to make 3 important acquisitions for George. The first, through the architect James Adam, was the collection of Cardinal Albani, which included the collection of Cassiano dal Pozzo, who was perhaps the greatest print collector of the 17th century. And this collection included important early maps, such as the one that you're looking at. So this was one collection, and it was enormous. The second collection was a collection of Consul Smith, and Bute organized the purchase through his own brother. Now, the Smith collection contained a magnificent library. It's best known for the Canaletto paintings, which are still in the Royal Collection. But it included some very, very important maps, such as this map of Venice, which became the standard image of Venice throughout the 18th century. But the third thing that was acquired in 1762 was a whole load of modern maps. And this is one of them. It's a map of New Hampshire that had just been published. It's dated 1761. It actually appeared in 1762. And it contains exactly the sort of information that George would have wanted. There's a geographical information, there's a due caution about what was known, what wasn't known, and notice that there's also historical notes. So through the maps, George was looking at geography, George was looking at history, he was also looking at politics. And here you actually see the receipt for this very map. And you can see it's at the top, the King's Most Excellent Majesty, but it's received of the Right Honourable the Earl of Bute, and it's signed by Thomas Jeffries. So the importance of Bute and of George's background and his love of maps can't be understated. However, accompanying it was a great personal passion for maps, and in part, this was due to George's native curiosity. He just wanted to know. But it was also, it found expression in a desire for facts. And this quote about George, topography is one of his favourite studies. He copies every chart, takes models, knows the soundings of the chief harbours of Europe. This man is just out to learn facts. And this is the sort of map, which incidentally comes from his collection, which would have satisfied him. It shows Falmouth Harbour with all the soundings he could ever want. Such was his passion for geography that he included a personification of geography in the ceiling of his wife's drawing room in Windsor. This was painted by Benjamin West, but the fact that he chose geography is in itself significant. And he carried through his interest through his private sponsorship. He sponsored Cook. He sponsored John Harrison in establishing longitude at sea. Perhaps most interestingly, he supported Jeffries with his county maps and Jesse Ramsden in inventing the theodolite, which was later to prove the most important single element in the mapping of England by Ordnance Survey. However, George was not an antiquarian. Alexander Dalrymple, who achieved much he was a hydrographer to the East India Company. Alexander Dalrymple was both interested in modern mapping and interested in ancient mapping. I tell you that George was not. Yes, of course, he had historic maps like this copy of the Ptolemy, but he put these maps in his library, not in his map collection. And in his map collection, you see late editions of, in this case, John Speed, with a map absolutely pristine. But if you look at the sides, the fashion plates are from faded plates. And as far as George was concerned, that really didn't matter. He was not a map collector in the way that nowadays you get antiquarian map collectors. But his passion for maps was enormous. This is a view of the predecessor of Buckingham Palace. And here is a plan of the layout. And here is the wing that he created for his library. Here is his bedroom. Here is his great or west library. This is what it looked like. So the first room next to his bedroom was packed full of maps. Do you see the two globes, the map rolls, and even the big volumes in the front weren't books, they contained dissected maps. And how do we know that George was really interested? Because he left a mark. In 1789, when he was probably contemplating moving to Hanover, and I like to imagine this as one dark evening, he wandered to the room next door to look at plans of palaces in Hanover. And he put in a bookmarker containing sketches that he'd done during his period of insanity. And that bookmark was only discovered about 20 years ago. And even in his public persona, he had no objections to being portrayed, as here in the Great Seal of Canada, pointing at a map. And it's very rare to get a map in this sort of setting. But why did George acquire maps? Well, he acquired them in part because it was part of his job as king. And an element of it was his glory as king. The other element of it was to enable him to function properly as a monarch. Well, the glory part came in the fact that there was competition between monarchs in Europe at that time to assemble the very best map collection. This is the Imperial Library in Vienna, and you'll notice that amidst all the books, there are two globes. And if we could open some of the volumes and some of the maps, we would find on the top right the secret atlas of the East India Company. This was part of an atlas or a collection of maps that had been formed by Prince Eugene of Savoy was purchased by the Imperial Court. And this was one of the glories of the Imperial Court. To the left, you see Philip von Stosch, who was a polymath who acquired all sorts of enormous collections, but among them was an important collection of maps. Bute tried to acquire this collection for George III, but he was thwarted by the Imperial Court, which is the reason why it's in Vienna. So in other words, there was competition for maps. But much more important, really, was the fact that maps were useful, and particularly for George, who took a very down-to-earth attitude over this. And why was he interested in maps? Because he believed that with maps, he could dispense with ministers. This was expressed by Louis XV in 1747, when he told Cassini du Turri, who was then engaged in mapping France, that with a map in his hand, he could see his outlying regions without the need for interpretation by ministers or generals. And this is visually expressed in this frontispiece to Ferraris' survey of the southern Netherlands, where you get Emperor Joseph II being presented with a map by his ministers, but behind you've got a military campaign in progress, and you know, or you're supposed to know, this is actually being directed by Joseph thanks to the maps. George used his maps in two different ways. It's often forgotten that, as well as being King of Great Britain, he was also Elector of Hanover, an absolute ruler of Hanover. And as absolute ruler of Hanover, he pursued his own policy. And one small element of this policy was to ensure that the county of Bentheim became part of the electorate of Hanover. It had been mortgaged by its count to George II in 1753, but the Hanoverian hold of it was weak. So this map of the forests in Bentheim, which apart from hunting also represented an important source of income, was very important to George as elector. But in Great Britain, maps served a slightly different purpose. Here, they were a vital element in George's efforts to maintain his position independent of and above faction. Maps represented what he thought, wrongly, was an objective source of information which would enable him to challenge his ministers when he felt it was necessary. In order to do so, he needed to acquire his own collection of maps, and he did so in the form of the General Atlas, which is not what you might consider an atlas to be. It's actually an enormous collection of loose maps, of map rolls, of wall maps, of charts, and of volumes. So what did this atlas contain? How was it acquired? And what were the categories of maps? And this is what I'm now going to cover. Well, the atlas contained 47,000 maps, charts, and plans, but also views. And this is the makeup. The top right-hand corner is world maps, but for the rest, if you analyze it, they're 40% covering Great Britain, 12% covering Italy, though this is rather cultural than political, 10% covering France, 10% covering the Low Countries, which were right across the sea from England and essential from the standpoint of national defence, 10% roughly covering Germany, but this included a lot of maps of Hanover. By contrast, and I think this is extremely significant, only 3% covered North America and the Caribbean, and 1% covered India. And Australia hardly gets a look in, but that perhaps is not surprising. And next to the maps, there were the views. And, you know, I've been asked to talk about the maps, but it must be remembered all the time that 30% of the collection consists of views, because they were another way, as far as George was concerned, of seeing reality. They were not intended, they did not owe their place in the collection as works of fine art, though some are works of fine art. But here you've got a view in Florida, and here you've got a view, albeit by Paul Sandby, in Scotland. But since George never left South England, this was, for him, the reality. Now, how did he acquire the material? Well, he had a regiment of librarians, and they made sure of acquiring the latest and most modern British maps. This Richard Horwood's map is perhaps the most accurate map to be produced of London in around 1800. And here you can see the detail. Through this map, George saw individual houses in London. He could see vinegar manufactories, he could see hospitals, he could see Whitfield's Tabernacle. This gave him a vision of London and of parts of London that he would otherwise never have visited. Another way in which George built up his collection was through inheritance, and in fact he inherited one hell of a lot of maps, including that enormous atlas that we saw at the beginning. But many of these maps were still highly relevant, such as, for instance, this plan of Fort William in the Highlands. You know, George was not blessed with the knowledge that the Jacobite threat would disappear. This was still of relevance to him. But George also commissioned maps, and of a whole variety of maps. As elector, he commissioned a detailed survey of his electorate at a scale that was not to be equalled in Great Britain, for a whole variety of reasons, until the 1840s. And in fact, in some cases, he had detailed maps of such a detail that he was able almost to identify every tree in a small principality. At the other end of the scale, he commissioned maps privately, such as this little manuscript atlas, showing the route from London to Weymouth, where George spent the summers between 1789 and 1804. But perhaps the most interesting parts of his collection were those maps that were presented. Now, occasionally you get the presentation copy with a little note, and it sounds very anodyne. This collection of maps of plans of the two Sicilies is presented by William Hamilton, the husband of Emma Hamilton, and it all sounds very twee. Well, in fact, the background story was that George had been furious that William Hamilton had been sending maps to his ministers, but not to himself. And so here he acquired plans like this showing Messina. And between 1772 and 1774, George made a concerted effort to force the Board of Trade and Plantation and Colonies to divulge the mapping that had been taking place in North America over the previous decade or so. Now, Max Edelson will be talking more about this, but suffice it to say that this volume contains all the detailed maps of the southern states by William Gerard de Brougham, and in the same years, copies of other surveys in North America were being presented to the king. Now, another thing that is quite amusing in a way is that George had a habit of retaining papers that he thought were interesting, and this is a fairly typical example. This is a plan of South Australia done for George Vancouver, which was enclosed in a letter from the Governor of New South Wales to the Home Secretary. But George kept it, and if you go down to the National Archives, you'll see the original letter with the sad note by an archivist of the 19th century that the enclosures were missing. Well, they're in the British Library. And it's a similar story with this map by James Cook of Saint-Pierre-and-Miquelon, which was passed to George III for approval in 1767 by the Admiralty and kept by him. But it's also fair to say that in some cases, maps that were presented to George III were handed by him to other people, with the result that perhaps the best map of Ireland of the late 18th century by Francis Beaufort, the presentation copy, is now in error. George also picked up a certain amount of material by espionage, and here's a letter noting that 50 guineas had been paid for a whole collection of maps, including this rather up-to-date map of Metz, all for George's private collection. Now, what sort of maps did George acquire? Well, he acquired political maps, and perhaps the outstanding political map is this so-called Redline map of North America. It was long believed that this map was the actual map that was used in Paris in the negotiations of the British with the American soon-to-be non-colonists. It's annotated to show differing interpretations of treaties, and this is the reason why it's known as the Redline map. But this particular copy is almost certainly a copy of the Oswald map that was prepared for George simply because without it he wouldn't be able to follow the course of the negotiations. But it's an indication of George really taking his ruling responsibilities very seriously. If we move on to the end of the 18th century, you get maps like this. Now, this map was sent to George by the people who wanted to create the London docks. And they wanted George to order his MPs to vote for the project when it came before Parliament. The trouble is, if you look at this map, that it really argues against itself, because to create the docks, there would be mass demolition work necessary, unlike a project in the Isle of Dogs where there were no buildings. And that's the reason why you've got all of the written explanation, which boils down to the fact that the houses didn't matter since they were occupied by poor people anyway. So as well as the political maps, there are the surveys, and we've seen some of the American surveys, but George also had the official Roy survey of Scotland, the first detailed survey of that kingdom, which, though executed in 1755, he only acquired after 1791. He had similar mapping of Ireland and of the Netherlands. And he also had more detailed plans of individual forts, like this plan of the new fort at Pittsburgh, which is a copy of 1769 of an original now in the National Archives of 1759. He not only had maps of proposals for ports in England and forts in England like Portsmouth, but he also retained the written texts explaining what was to be done. And he had the products of spy missions, such as this, I think, magnificent plan of Ferrol in Galicia, done by Hugh de Beag, who was sent off on a spy mission in these years. I mean, this was, if he'd been caught by the Spaniards, God knows what would have happened to him. And here you've got a similar sort of survey of India. So if you can imagine, George has his eyes in detail on the whole world, not forgetting the areas around London. He had encampment plans of his forces, and this map shows an encampment on Finchley Common at the time of the Gordon riots. And here you've got the Battle of Culloden. But it wasn't only manuscript maps that he wanted, it was also printed surveys. So he naturally had Thomas Jeffries' West Indian Atlas. He also later acquired the latest mapping of Venice. And he even, through his grandfather, had the most detailed mapping of China, done by the Jesuits between 1716 and 1718. This particular map was presented to George I by the man who engraved it, Matteo Lipa, and it's his annotation there which points out the line of the Great Wall of China. And George was also interested in detailed depictions of towns, of small areas. This is a plan of Charleston in South Carolina. It's notable, first of all, because it's the earliest surviving fire insurance plan, but secondly, because it shows George's continuing interest in North America after the United States came into existence. And just as he was interested in the States, so obviously he's interested in his own country, and he acquired this really beautiful, detailed depiction of St. Pancras, of the parish of St. Pancras, with the individual houses picked out. So we've got political maps, we've got surveys of different scales, but above all, also, George is interested in industry, trade, and commerce. So his collection includes a lot of canal plans like this. It includes a surprising number of plans of collieries and industry in Great Britain. Some of these maps are extremely rare. And because he's interested deeply in industry, he also has this fascinating plan of a mirror factory in Minden in Germany, done by his military engineers, because in the middle of it, it shows an ideal village for the factory workers. And clearly, this is George, as the father of his country, taking an interest in the latest developments. Now, when we talk about how he used his maps, it's fairly easy to say that in certain cases he did use his map. This is a plan that was sent to him when he visited Lord Amherst in his home in Montreal in Kent. And there's Montreal, and accompanying this map were written instructions on how to go there. So clearly George used it, even if he later kept it for his collection. But there's another point. George's collection was absolutely vast. And I think he was able, more than anybody else, to get multiple views of the same place. This is an unusual map of Gibraltar, because it's done not by a British soldier, but by one of the family who were responsible for his surveying activities in Hanover. And this must have been asked for by George. And next to it, you see the same area depicted by an English military engineer. And apart from the difference in style, you can see a difference in content. And I can see George actually absorbing the lessons of the Hanoverian map to quiz his generals about the defense of Gibraltar. However, George's familiarity with maps lasted only for as long as he could see. And after 1806, he couldn't. And so for the last 14 years of his life, or rather the last 5 years of his active life, maps certainly played no part. However, the sharp-eyed among you will have noticed that I haven't actually answered the question of what concrete influence did maps have, in particular cases, on George's policy. And the simple answer is that searching for references in letters is like searching for a needle in a haystack, until the Georgian Papers project is completed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Possibly we'll be contacting the Guinness Book of Records to see if that's the most PowerPoints ever shown in half an hour. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over to Max Edelson for his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Arthur in particular for extending this invitation for me to present here, to Kings, to all the other Maxes on the panel, and to Peter. I hope you reserved a little part of your visual cortex to absorb some more maps, because I have some more to show. And while Peter focused on the monarch himself as an individual who had a personal relationship with these maps, I'm going to be circling around some of the same images, but really from the perspective of the crown, which included the king and all the agencies focused on North America and the West Indies in the generation before the American Revolution. So I'd like to begin by just thinking a little bit about where my research began. I started my work as a map historian at the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress is the largest library in the world. It has the largest map collection in the world. And the collections have such quantity and breadth that the library can lay claim to the mission of trying to be a general repository of human knowledge. And thinking about the map collection with its more than 5 million objects, that tries to aspire to something even more particular, a record of how human cultures have visualized geographic space. These millions of maps in this collection cover every part of the globe. Each one is a snapshot image designed to capture its essence as a place at a particular moment in time. So when I started my research at the library a little less than a decade ago, I began looking at maps that British surveyors had made in the generation before the American Revolution. The images that the librarians brought me from the library's map vault surprised me. I expected to see many more maps of places like Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Virginia, the centers of wealth, population, and power in early America. Instead, they brought me map after map of the frigid shores of Nova Scotia, the tropical island of Dominica, and the swampy lands along the eastern side of the Mississippi River. These maps were created to plan an ambitious array of new colonies in North America and the West Indies, but the schemes they were drafted to illustrate in the 1760s and the 1770s collapsed under the weight of unrealistic expectations. They became historic artifacts rather than working documents of imperial administration. I've looked at hundreds, probably thousands of these images in the past several years. They are scattered now in libraries in the UK and the US and elsewhere. And in the book I've just published, I've curated what I think of as a representative sample of the maps that mattered as Britain imagined America. Maps, I think, are the means by which Great Britain dreamed of a great Atlantic empire, and part of the story of how it lost this great Atlantic empire. There are 257 enumerated maps or map collections that I feature in my book that attempt to show the scope and intensity of these British efforts to remake America. This ambition to transform America into the images traced on these maps reveals an idealism at the heart of Britain's vision for America, as well as a degree of hubris about the power to effect such change. Instead of putting this Western empire on a sound and rational foundation, Britain's new colonial plan helped provoke American colonists and strengthen their resolve to seek independence. By virtue of its global military victories during the 7 Years' War, Britain claimed vast cessions of territory from France and Spain as these rival powers worked to negotiate an end to the war. In 1763, in celebration and acknowledgement of the Peace of Paris, mapmaker Emmanuel Bowen pictured the new extent of Britain's Western Empire. His accurate map of North America showed it stretching from Hudson Bay to the Florida Keys, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and across new islands in the West Indies. To better rule these vast dominions, Britain set out to map these new territories with unprecedented rigor and precision. Great Britain oversaw this empire through a small office in the Treasury Building in Whitehall. The Lords Commissioners of Trade and Plantations, or the Board of Trade as it was commonly known, managed information and created policy for overseas colonies. With the Board of Trade's power to describe America to King and Parliament came the power to attempt to shape it into a new form. Now that Britain had gained these new dominions, George III commanded the Board of Trade to provide a plan for how these lands could be transformed into new colonies. In response, the Lords of Trade wrote their Report on Acquisitions in America, essentially a blueprint for a new and reformed empire. To illustrate this report, they purchased a copy of Bowen's accurate map of North America. In fact, it's this copy that's in the UK National Archives. The Lords of Trade annotated this map by hand. They used lines and color to make their plan visible to George III and the others who scrutinized this report. Their leading idea was that British America should be reformed to keep all of its subjects within a tightly controlled Atlantic sphere of influence along the coast. When France ruled Canada, New France had sprawled to the Great Lakes. The board's map presented a compact new colony of Quebec designed to keep settlers in the orbit of the St. Lawrence River. Spanish Florida had once been a vast province that occupied the entire North American southeast. The Lords of Trade divided this new territory into much more compact forms: East Florida on the peninsula and West Florida along the Gulf Coast. And in the Southeast Caribbean, they highlighted 4 new islands that offered 2 great advantages. By taking possession of Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago, Britain now controlled the sea lanes by which most shipping entered the Caribbean. These new islands also offered uncultivated tropical land with which to expand slavery and sugar cultivation. Perhaps most famously, the board drew a red line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, imposing a limit to settler expansion in North America. The King's Proclamation of 1763 took the Board of Trade's recommendations for America and gave them legal authority. The King took the board's line drawn across this map for the first time and made it into what historians now think of as the Proclamation line, which ordered colonial governors to make no new grants of land beyond it. Taken together, the Board of Trade's map expressed a new vision of America, a place that should be more controlled, more orderly, more stable than the volatile world that it existed in fact in 1763. One of the challenges of the peace was that it set the boundary of British North America at the Mississippi, but did not give Britain independent access to navigate this great American river. As part of the peace agreement, France agreed to leave North America, but Spain would only give up Florida if it could inherit the former French colony of Louisiana. This swap of territories, the King of Spain at least hoped, would keep Britain at a safe distance from the rest of Spanish America. But it meant that the British had to find an alternative route from the Gulf of Mexico to the Mississippi River that avoided New Orleans. At the peace negotiations, maps seemed to suggest a solution to this problem. We aren't sure exactly which maps the Earl of Bute consulted as he set the new boundary between Britain and Spain along the Gulf of Mexico in 1762. But any authoritative map of the region printed in Paris would have shown a clear water route from the Gulf to the Mississippi River that didn't pass under the guns of New Orleans. Boats could enter the passage known as the Rigolettes. They could cross Lakes Pontchartrain and Maurepas and proceed along the Iberville River until it terminated at the Mississippi. The open waterway that appeared unobstructed on paper, however, turned out to be a stream so narrow that boatmen had to strike the masts of their ships to pass under an interlocking canopy of trees that grew on both sides of its banks. When Army Lieutenant Philip Pittman tried to reach the Mississippi along this Iberville River route in 1765, he switched from black-colored fathoms to red-colored feet as this passage became more shallow. At 6 miles out, he declared 2 feet of clearance, and his party left their mired flatboats along the shore and made its way on foot to the Mississippi River. The passage was so choked up by wood, Pittman wrote, that soldiers detailed from Pensacola and a gang of 50 hired slaves spent months clearing it before the army could build its new fort along the Mississippi. Within a year, however, new debris clogged the passage that they had so laboriously opened. The free navigation of the Mississippi is a joke, concluded another Army surveyor, Harry Gordon. He predicted that no vessel will come to Iberville from the sea. The error of the peace negotiators, he charged, had rendered what might have been the empire's most valuable colony into useless land, cut off from any safe path to the Gulf of Mexico. This quandary inspired plans to dig a canal above the fort to provide water that might open to navigation. And here's the ditch proposed that was going to bring all this Mississippi River water into the clogged Iberville River and make it navigable for ships. These schemes, tried again and again, came to nothing. Although the British granted tens of thousands of acres of new land in the colony of West Florida, they never solved this problem, caused by their assumption that lines on maps reflected realities on the ground. After the American Revolution, Britain retroceded Florida to Spain, giving up on it. The Board of Trade drew a red line across the mountains on Emanuel Bowen's map of North America and hoped that this act of geographic division could promote peace on a violent Indian frontier. The prospect of the Proclamation line was an opportunity to imagine a different, better version of American history. Instead of driving Native Americans off their lands, colonial governments might have negotiated a settlement in which they agreed to keep colonists east of the mountains, leaving the western interior to the various Indian nations. We can imagine an alternative history in which settlers honored the proclamation and restrained themselves from stepping over the line. One rare manuscript map pictures what this world of frontier peace might have looked like. After his meeting with the southern tribes, Indian Superintendent John Stewart drew a map of the native nations in his district. When the Board of Trade's clerks unrolled this map in Whitehall in 1764, they would have been among the very first to behold a novel imagined geography of empire. Native nations side by side with British colonies, filling up the king's dominions in North America. On this map, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Cherokees, and the Creek Indians each had a national space on this new map of empire that promised that their rights as subjects of the king would be respected. Despite the vision of peaceful coexistence drawn across this map, the forces driving settlement into the continental interior were just too powerful, and the Native Americans too few to resist it forever. As historian Patrick Griffin puts it, even as the proclamation was being proclaimed, speculators in America sought to claim lands west of the mountains, forming companies, dispatching surveyors, as if the proclamation line did not exist. In an important sense, however, this line did not exist, except as a shape drawn across the surface of paper maps. One of the reasons this vision of Anglo-Indian amity failed was because no one could locate this abstract boundary of the proclamation line in the real spaces of eastern North America. The Board of Trade's red line, and you can see it faintly traced here on this detail of the map, tried to separate western rivers that flowed toward the Mississippi from eastern rivers that flowed toward the Atlantic. But although this map seems authoritative, no one had actually surveyed North America's interior. These shapes representing mountains on the map were much more art than science. Although they thought they were dividing North America between Indians and colonists, the Lords of Trade were really inking a line across a terra incognita. A glance at the most popular image of the proclamation line revealed this to be true. John Gibson created a map for the October 1763 issue of the Gentleman's Magazine. On it, he compresses the Appalachians into a single ridgeline. In bold letters across the Mississippi River watershed, he declared the interior to be lands reserved for the Indians. Geologists call the Appalachian Mountains a cordillera because they resemble a vast braided rope. These mountains sprawl across hundreds of thousands of square miles. They are made up of complex formations of ridges, foothills, valleys, and dissected plateaus. No colonial map could make sense of such geographic complexity, much less provide the information that would have been needed to draw a neat line across it. So once again, Great Britain put its faith in maps that simplified and distorted the realities of the New World. There's another part of the story of the Proclamation Line, however, that deserves to be told. British officials knew that the Proclamation Line was more of an idea than a real boundary. So they worked to negotiate a diplomatic boundary with the Indian nations, and they invited Native Americans to help define its course. By 1768, the British were able to trace this real boundary from the banks of the Mississippi River to the edge of Iroquois country in what is now upstate New York. I'd like to show you just one of the hundreds of maps that this process of boundary negotiation generated. The Cherokee Indians met with the British Indian Superintendent in 1765 at Fort Prince George in the Carolina backcountry. There, both sides agreed to a new boundary between South Carolina and the Cherokee Nation. They agreed that a 50-mile stretch of this boundary should pass through a place called Devise's Corner, a small trading post on a bend of Long Cane Creek. This spot had witnessed an especially violent episode just a few years earlier. The Cherokees considered Long Cane Creek to be their boundary with British Carolina, but with so many tributaries extending from its main branch, where this creek began and ended was open to interpretation. As new immigrants surged into the area by the hundreds, the Cherokees believed that this unwritten understanding of their boundary with Carolina had been violated. This encroachment emboldened a party of young Indian men to attack the Long Cane settlements in 1760, killing more than 100 colonists. To resolve this bloody frontier, surveyor John Pickens marked a new boundary across the many tiny rivers, creeks, and streams of this contested area. To give this line credibility, a party of Cherokee headmen accompanied the survey and signed the map to verify that they had done so. After 1766, Cherokee travelers found a blazed path It was marked by sunk posts and notched trees, poplars, pines, chestnuts, and black oaks, each of them marked on the map. This path created an objective basis for orientation that allowed Native Americans as well as Europeans to see each waterway and each new settlement in relation to an observable line. The talks at Fort Prince George that produced this boundary line were one of a dozen official negotiations that determined a continental Indian boundary, segment by segment, across this frontier. Britain placed resources and hope in a general settlement to the problem of settlers and Indians sharing space in North America. But in the end, British Americans could not tolerate the idea that they did not have the right to colonize this continent. Their complaints about the limits imposed by the Proclamation line was one of the factors that drove their resistance to British rule and led to the American Revolution. The negotiated Indian boundary line marked the edges of colonial settlements about where they were in 1770. By 1780, as the War of Independence raged, settlers began pushing beyond this line. After independence, by 1790, it no longer had any legal authority to restrain them from advancing into Indian lands. An important part of the Board of Trade's vision for the new improved empire was the notion that they could balance the interests of Indians and settlers. When Britain withdrew from the heart of the continent, the government of the United States and Western migrants and land speculators aligned against native nations to dispossess them. Now let's turn to another part of this new empire. Today, Prince Edward Island, once known as the island of St. John, appears as a peaceful farming community located on a beautiful natural site. It's one that has been romanticized on page and screen in Lucy Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables stories. But this image hides a tumultuous 18th century past, when Britain made the island into a laboratory for improved colonization. The Board of Trade appointed Army Captain Samuel Holland as its Surveyor General for the Northern District of North America. His first task was to go to St. John Island and prepare this underpopulated place for intensive settlement. In February 1765, Holland dispatched 4 teams to different portions of the island's coast, each consisting of a surveyor, 3 soldiers, a sailor, and a French-Canadian guide. By dog sled and snowshoe, these surveyors began the coastal survey of St. John. In the pages of this rare 18th century sketchbook, we can see how British surveyors built a new image of the island. Assistant Surveyor Thomas Wright drew the contours of the western part of the island during the summer of 1765. His team produced these images over 26 days at a pace of about 7 miles per day, creating the data needed to represent some 200 miles of coastline by the end of the summer. Based on these surveys, Surveyor General Holland divided the entire island into 67 townships of 20,000 acres apiece. These were granted by lottery to British investors who promised to populate them with tenant farmers. Instead of allowing colonists to claim land where they wished, these maps represented a new kind of imperial expansion that would be organized and controlled rationally from London. This system took the choice of land away from landowners. The best townships had cleared fields, structures left behind by French colonists whom the British Army had deported during the war. These ideal tracts had good farmland and especially access to fishing harbors that faced the Gulf of St. Lawrence. On this map, these prime locations that were identified and ranked and classified by the surveyors are colored green and blue. The worst townships, here colored red and yellow, were windswept, barren, and rocky. So who were these men who aspired to become the great landlords of St. John Island? Military officers shaded in red were the largest group of township holders. Those granted these townships on St. John included an admiral, a vice admiral, a commodore, and numerous lieutenants, captains, and colonels. Wartime experience had nurtured a well-connected entrepreneurial groups of men eager to seek their fortunes in the post-war empire. They partnered with merchants, and in one case a banker, and others who could promise capital and connections among London suppliers to help these new townships gain settlers and market their commodities. Senior officials who are shaded green on the map owned 9 townships outright and were partners in 10 more. 8 members of parliament, whose lands are colored blue, became township owners in in 1767, as did one peer of the House of Lords. Just before the American Revolution, Great Britain awarded new lands in the new territories to powerful men who were closely linked to the home government. Well-connected Britons, not Americans, were to become a new elite landowning class in the new territories. The British pinned their greatest hopes for America on Florida, a place that had long kindled European desires for tropical wealth. Of all the territories added to the empire in 1763, however, it was probably the one they knew the least about. The Surveyor General for the Southern District, a German-born army officer named William de Bram, we've already seen some of his maps today, was ordered south to scout the peninsula for inlets that opened up on as-yet undiscovered rivers. Once found, these inlets could become points of entry for new settlers. Florida was originally named for its floridity, its capacity to generate life in a lush natural space. The British arrived expecting to produce lucrative commodities, including indigo, silk, and wine, along the fertile banks of the rivers that would be discovered through these surveys. In 1765, William de Bram and his assistants boarded a schooner called the Augustine Packet to find these tantalizing new rivers of settlement. The best maps the British had pictured Florida disintegrating into islands at the edge of the continent. De Bram's elaborate hand-drawn charts established that Florida really was part of the mainland. But its rivers were surprising. North of St. Augustine, on much of the North Atlantic coast, most seaboard rivers flowed from the mountains toward the coastline. In Florida, the rivers he found ran parallel to the shore, just behind the sand dunes and the mangrove swamps. Wherever the Surveyor General found inlets, he entered these rivers they served, and he scouted for land for prospective plantations. Beyond the point where he could see these lands through a telescope from a rowboat, they remained unmapped. De Bram filled these blank spaces on these charts with his own handwritten sailing instructions, observations on nature and land quality, and especially appraisals of this land's value for agriculture. Despite British hopes, de Bram offered a mixed report of the lands behind these 4 new inlets he discovered. Many were obstructed by dangerous sandbars and offered a limited supply of plantable land. The governor of East Florida, a Scottish nobleman and army colonel named James Grant, had great hopes for the first major inlet south of St. Augustine, a place the Spanish had given the inauspicious name the Mosquitoes. Grant wanted de Bram to confirm the virtues of the Mosquitoes district, and the surveyor paid special attention to this place. His special chart of the Mosquito Inlet showed the depths of its waterways and divided the highland from the swamp and the marsh at 1 mile to the inch, twice the resolution of his other charts. He sent this particular chart, the product of 3 weeks of surveying, to the Board of Trade in 1765, along with a 13-page report that gave a highly negative opinion of its harbor. His chart revealed the maze of narrow channels constricted by shifting sandbanks at the inlet's mouth, leaving as little as 10 feet of clearance at high tide. Spectacular plantation failures reveal the consequences of the Board of Trade's unrealistic expectations for East Florida. The first major settlement at the Mosquitoes was Dr. Andrew Turnbull's New Smyrna plantation. Turnbull believed that since Florida shared roughly the same latitude as the Mediterranean, the best people to work this new land would be poor peasants from the Greek islands, and he rounded up about 1,000 of them to labor as indentured servants on his remote plantation. They suffered high death rates and ultimately abandoned the settlement by 1777. The path intended for the new ceded islands of Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago was clear. Britain knew exactly what these islands were supposed to be for: planting sugar, consuming slaves, and making money. To create ideal sugar islands, the Board of Trade sent surveyors to divide them into tracts proper for plantations, they wrote, and auction them off in London to the highest bidder. Surveyor John Byers created a series of maps that expressed this vision of managed Caribbean colonization. His map of the island of Dominica revealed a place primed for production and crisscrossed with the boundaries of new plantation tracts. It even included an idealized plan for a new model port town, a place that was to be called Portsmouth, that never became more than a sleepy village, despite this grid of lots he displayed on this map. On Dominica, 12 landowners merged their tracts to form the Rosalie Company Estates. This enterprise was, in fact, a vast real estate scheme. In little more than a decade, the partners of this Rosalie Estates had established a large and well-ordered sugar plantation at the mouth of the Rosalie River, and they named it Seaside Estate. They hired surveyor Isaac Werden to create a comprehensive map of this property, in part to attract investors who might purchase its undeveloped lands. Slaves had cleared and planted about a third of this tract's 548 acres in sugar cane across 23 fields. Where the river met the shores of Rosalie Bay, they constructed a showplace plantation that featured scores of buildings clustered together to grind, boil, and pack sugar and house, feed, and monitor a few white employees and many enslaved workers. Across a small stream from the mansion house, slaves slept in a compound of 15 houses. A large formal garden intersected with walking paths filled the space between black and white living spaces. The partners showed signs that they wanted to produce a plantation that cared for the survival of enslaved laborers. They built a hospital staffed with a nurse to promise that they would follow a different path than the conventional West Indian practice of working slaves to death in the sugar fields. The cartographer added a pictorial view of seaside settlement in a large watercolor inset at the corner of his plan. Next to a bird's eye overview of structures and layout, this image captured the poetry of this place for the eyes of prospective British planters. It showed how Rosalie's partners had put a stamp of civility on Dominica's wild landscape. Even the necessary house was separated from the mansion by a neat fence line, and it bore a steeply hipped, ornamented roof whose style was repeated in the manager's residence. Nothing, in my view, revealed the idea of harmonious order that these maps sought to convey than the image of two figures who were pictured in the foreground of this image. Along a road shaded by the leaves of growing sugarcane plants in field 22, a white man wearing a tricorn hat and a blue greatcoat gestures with his left hand, maybe speaking words of greeting or instruction, to a faceless black man dressed only in undyed breeches. Both hold walking sticks, suggesting that they maybe just encountered one another along the path, but neither threatened nor feared violence from one another in this unguarded corner of the estate. Rosalie was a place, this image said, in which an enterprising Briton could assume the stature of an improving gentleman on an impressive scale and become rich by helping to create a society characterized by beauty, productivity, and utility. A counter image to the one I've just discussed shows an opposite vision of this land. The same surveyor, Isaac Werden, was commissioned to produce a second map. This one was designed to show all the lands that were to be written off as impracticable, that is, couldn't be cultivated. And in this image of steep ravines and broken landscapes impossible to grow sugar on, we see a mirror image of this image of West Indian landed affluence. So I'd like to conclude by offering some reflections on these new maps of empire and what they meant to the history of colonial America and the American Revolution. Although these maps set new standards for precision, the most interesting thing about them to me is not their accuracy, but rather the way they picture Britain's American territories as improved spaces. Overlaid on top of a natural geography were imperial boundaries, property lines, inhabitants, routes of trade, shaped to form and formed to connect each place like a cog fitted into a great machine, into a system of imperial political economy that was centered in London. By attempting to take control over America, Great Britain put forward a new vision of an imperial world perfected and balanced among competing places and competing interests. It experimented with new methods for settling these new territories. It regulated the distribution of land to create societies that were supposed to be prosperous, sustainable, and defensible. In the end, British efforts to reform America, no matter how well-intentioned, provoked furious resistance from colonists that culminated in a revolution that destroyed the empire that these maps were drafted to bring to perfection. By understanding these geographic dimensions of empire, I think we can see the American Revolution in a new light, as the quest of a powerfully expansive settler society to thwart this vision of improvement and retain its right to colonize the New World.
Well, thank you very much, Max. And if I can now invite Max 2 and Peter to join us on the dais. I'm going to ask Max Edelson just to offer a brief comment or question to the others to begin with, and then we'll open the questions. If you've got 15 minutes, then you can start the conversation here, then transfer it up to chapters after that. So I'll hand over to Max. Yeah.
Right, thanks. I'll try to be brief. And I really would, I'm a historian of the early United States. I'm not a British Imperial historian, and I'm not an expert on maps. So I guess my question or comment has to do with what all of this means to historical interpretation in general. So I would really like you to think a little bit about the broader implications of studying maps for the history of this period. So coming from my own area, I would say that there are two things that strike me here, a little different from the conclusions of Max, but there are similarities here too. So one thing has to do with continuity. I would say that even though the early United States certainly didn't have the resources of the British Empire, certainly didn't produce as beautiful maps, a lot of the practices that created this need for maps continued into the period of the early United States. So we need only to think about things like the 7 ranges laid out in the Ohio country meant to sell land to settlers, or the many Indian treatises that all had this element of drawing a borderline between white settlements and American Indians. So this suggests to me that there's an element of continuity here that we can think about rethink the American Revolution as maybe not this moment of transition, but an event where there is much more in terms of continuity, where we can see the United States as the successor regime to the British Empire. The other thing that struck me was the way that the maps point to what I would call the materiality of historical processes. We have thought for so long about the American Revolution and that whole era in terms of culture, so discussing it in an idiom of culture. And I think what maps are really interesting for is that they point to something different. They point to geopolitics on the one hand, and they point to land on the other hand. So I'm wondering here if maps maybe can help us reconsider this period and how to think about it, and look more at the struggles over material things like property, rather than just as an intellectual or cultural struggle between the colonists and the British Empire. So these reflections may not make much sense to you, but I would really like to hear your ideas about the broader implications here of studying maps for historical interpretation more generally. Thanks.
Yes, I think your general conclusion about continuity is one that I have as well. Although my book doesn't go too much past the American Revolution, I think the United States government inherits precisely the same problems that the British government had. In fact, it has to reckon with individual states that are destabilizing the Indian frontier, trying to impose a general system, and it has to come up with a plan for colonization that will balance competing interests. So I think that's, it's not a book I'm planning on writing, but I think it would follow from this research quite directly. And I think you're right too to point to a new way, at least that I'm thinking about maps. I think the greatest change in the way maps have been interpreted in the past several decades is to see them as subjective artifacts, not just as transparent reflections of the material world, that they're ideological, that they can be interpreted in the way literary scholars interpret texts, And while I think that's true, what I've tried to do is build a political context for understanding them as well. Because especially with these maps produced by powerful states to achieve an objective, you can't understand them just in terms of the artistry of what the map maker intended within the frame of the map. You have to see the project of map making and the documents that articulated that project and the response to those documents. So in my view, maps function less as the object of study than as the key sources to write that kind of broader political history.
Could I come in? I think if you're looking at the matter from the British Isles, something very interesting happens between the surveys of the 1760s and 1770s and that plan of Charleston, which I showed you. As long as George rules North America, he's got massive problems which perhaps could be answered through detailed survey. Once he ceases to rule it, America becomes a place where Britain can reap profit from insuring Charleston against fire. And instead of harvesting, well, basically, it can get all the money that it wanted through premiums paid willingly by an independent nation without the costs of having to defend it. So I think in this respect, the plan of Charleston does encapsulate the post-colonial phase when Britain still to get profit from North America, but with none of their defensive overheads.
We can take some questions from the floor. There should be a roving microphone available. Yes, Sophie, if anyone's got a question, raise your arm prominently so we can get a microphone to you. Start over there.
Hello? Hello?
It's working.
Oh, it is. How many of the maps that you used in the book were sort of government-funded surveys as opposed to commercially produced maps? And what was the interplay between people like Jeffries who were producing maps more for a commercial basis as opposed to the government surveyors?
So if everyone didn't hear that question, the question was, how many of the maps that I study were produced by the state and how many were commercially produced? And I would say, I don't know the numbers, but one of the atlases that I focus on to begin this book is Jeffries' General Topography of North America. And Jeffries is the key figure to look at because he had a title as geographer to the king, but unlike France and Spain, which had state-sponsored map making as a secret enterprise of government, the English state and the British state after it used published maps as a way of, I guess, handling the costs of dissemination, but also as a way of proclaiming their ambitions for this world. So Jeffries' maps, one of the things I tried to do is to trace the original manuscript maps that were produced in the field and see what happens to them once Jeffries or another map publisher engraved versions of them and produced them. So my book is focused mostly on the manuscript maps produced by these surveyors, but especially the final chapter, which looks at the great atlases like the Atlantic Neptune Atlas. I try to see how that all came into the public view at the end of the project.
Can I? I mean, this is absolutely true, but what's also to be remembered is that at different times, different factions in government use people like Jeffries they leak maps to Jeffries as part of their campaign to win arguments at the cabinet table.
I'll wait for the question. I'll ask a question I had, which was, struck me there's a contrast potentially between the way maps function in old and new polities here. Because in your presentation maps, you were showing us these maps that oversimplified the North American continent, which then had to be modified in the light of experience when they were being implemented. Whereas I have a sense that some of my encounters with maps in 18th century Britain, that they are what reveal complexity that until you laid them out topographically, you don't notice. And in that sense, it's what complicates understanding of jurisdiction, where you can survive without a map, not worrying about whether it's territorially integrated or not. But the minute you see it on the map and it's not, suddenly that becomes a problem. So maybe there's a difference in terms of how these maps function in new and old states.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd put a new and old spectrum on it, but all maps are abstractions. They have to be,
because the density of real geography is too overwhelming to represent fully. So you have to abstract out those features that are most salient. And I think the great error of Great Britain and its use of cartography to create this new empire was that it's easy when you're looking at a map of a continent to just underestimate the sheer scale of the space and how much difference there is between the zoomed in qualities of a port or a bit of the coastline and then the vast territories in between. And this was, of course, a common critique of British military officers during the Revolution, saying there's a bunch of people in Whitehall looking at a map of North America and thinking we can just move here and move there. And on the ground, it became unfathomable and impossible to move that way. So I think they had to have a sense, that sense of abstraction in order to do this at all, because the challenges they were up against, if they'd been better revealed by their maps, might have given them pause for thought.
Can I come here? I mean, that's absolutely right, but at the same time, it's only fair to say that the British were, or many British leaders, were aware of the weaknesses of maps. And, for instance, in mainland Europe, they were just as prone to drawing lines for borders, but invariably, after drawing the line for borders, they commissioned commissioners from both sides to work out the details. So they knew that it was an abstraction, but as you said, you have to begin somewhere.
There's a question over here.
Yes, thank you. This is directed at Peter. That wonderful image of Buckingham House, the King's bedroom and the map room. Do we know how the maps themselves were classified and categorized or ordered, if you like? Was it done by geographical region or
Yes, we do.
by theme or something like that, military maps?
We do. They were organized essentially by region, but right at the start they had world maps, and then George had a particular category of rivers and canals and that sort of thing. But essentially it's geographical. And that is actually something that he copied from his uncle, who in turn copied it from a bookseller called John Innes, whose collection is now in Norfolk.
Thank you very much. Really a fascinating presentation. One thing, you can't map that period without mapping what was going on with the slave trade. If you think about it, whether it's those images there, or even if you think about how the American map changed with the Louisiana Purchase, which is in turn influenced by what happened with Haiti, or even the layout of Charleston, which was colonized by Barbadians who kind of exported their model of that. To what extent will our Georgian papers research make sure that those voices aren't heard in the maps? Because to some extent, that ideologically is what these maps are speaking about as much as many other things.
Yeah, one of my goals for this research was to make sure that the West Indies aren't forgotten in the story of revolution. And so I was really just simply following where the maps took me. So I was surprised. I didn't know much about the history of St. Vincent or Dominica. I didn't know much about Nova Scotia when I started. They were largely unfamiliar places to me, but these were the places that were mapped. So I wanted to make sure that the Caribbean resumed its place really at the center of imperial thought. So the ceded islands were part of this and belong right next to these other places and occupied as much thought as places that later became the United States and have been given more importance by historians. And in terms of your comment about how do we map the slave trade, this is something that digital humanists are working on and I'm working on, because we have this remarkable slave trade database, and you can visualize individual ships as dots that cross the Atlantic, and you can see in a way that statistical tables don't really make clear how the intensity of this trade shifts and changes. So I think part of what I'm doing here is not just a fancy way to show maps, but also a way to think of a visual approach to history that can convey those important things that get left behind.
Question? I think this will have to be our last question. I can see my superiors looking nervous. So,
several of the maps that you showed us look like the kind of maps that today would be produced by real estate developers in order to attract investors or to attract people involved. And all real estate developers, as in their maps, make things look better than they are. So some of the criticisms of the maps as being inaccurate or being impractical. How much of that could have simply been the sort of thing that all real estate developers did then and do now?
Well, in terms of the Dominica maps, I mean, yeah, Rosalie Estate was like a modern real estate scheme. I didn't show the other maps, but the undeveloped tracts were given names, just like a subdivision, right? Newfoundland and other things. And what people complained about who paid a lot of money to get these tracts of land was that at the scale of these island maps, it looked like there were only two forms of land. There was impassable mountains, and then there was the cultivatable plain. But once you got, that was there was some deception behind that, but I think a lot of it was just, when you look at a map at that resolution, you don't see the granularity of the landscape. And so people who actually bought those lands sight unseen, just looking at the map, were surprised to find them divided and less valuable than they thought they would be. So I think there is some bad intention behind it, but also the problem of scale kind of rears its head again in these maps.
Can I come in that any map is going to be subjective, and any map to an extent is going to be fiction? Because when you're looking at a map, you're not really looking at a landscape. You're looking at a mentality and a value system. And unless you're aware of this, you're going to be misled by maps.
Well, I'd like now to just draw tonight to a close and to thank all the speakers and those who helped produce these wonderful images as well, which I know is mainly your own work, but they are wonderful. Encourage you to explore these resources. Can we just visit your map scholar online? How does that work?
Yeah, so mapscholar.org contains all of the images you saw tonight, and mapscholar.org/empire has all of the maps for the book, and those are just available whether you buy the book or not.
So there you go. Buy the book, though. And before you do, come and join us upstairs in Chapters for drinks, and thank you for coming to tonight's opening session. Thank you.